Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Hall, and I'm the university's editor of The Guardian, and I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's panel. I'm delighted that so many of you are joining us on what is, in most of the UK, a glorious summer's day, or unless perhaps the reason why you're here is because we're sheltering from the heatwave, I don't know. But either way, we've been thrilled to receive hundreds of sign-ups, ranging from lecturers to policy wonks to interested parents and students. So I'm hoping that everyone will find something to take away from the session. Either way, the panel is shaping up to be a very interesting and timely discussion on the subject of whether the coronavirus crisis will shift universities online forever. We'll be discussing whether the online learning in which universities have invested huge sums of money to respond to social distancing is a quick fix for now, or if it could be a disruptive moment, to borrow language from the tech world, which will determine the future of higher education. To cheer over this issue, we've got four fantastic panellists who I will introduce shortly. In the meantime, I'm going to try and stay brief, as we've only got an hour to cover an enormous amount of ground. The way the panel will work is that I'm going to introduce each speaker, who's going to give us a few opening remarks responding to our overall question of whether the coronavirus crisis is going to shift universities online for good. I'll then follow up with a few questions of my own. Some of these will be targeted at specific panelists, or they'll raise a hand to respond. After about half an hour to 40 minutes, we're going to move on to the Q&A section. You can ask a question at any point during the panel by posting them in the Q&A function, which you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have a question for a specific panel member, then just say. Our events team are going to collate them and send them to me, and we'll get through as many as we can in the time available. So please make sure you include your full name and your job role in institution, if relevant, when you ask. Finally, just to let you know, we're going to be publishing a write-up of this event on the Guardian University's website next week. You can follow us on @GDN Universities to stay in the loop. So I won't keep you any longer. We'll get started with the discussion. And we're going to kick things off with Ian Dunn, who is the Provost of Coventry University, and he's spearheaded Coventry's shift to an increasingly digital curriculum through its Coventry University Online initiative. The university is kind of a known innovator in online learning, so he's going to start with his kind of opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's lovely to be invited to join you, and thank you for that. And the task that was given to us was, will the coronavirus pandemic be the disruptive moment that moves universities online forever? Well, I would argue that universities have been moving online rather too slowly, but for a very long time, 25 years at least, in the virtual learning environments. And the idea that our students have not been online learners in all of that time is a ridiculous one. The fact that we've been a little bit behind them is, I think, rather unfortunate. So what's the future of I think, in your words, the real world campus? I'd say that we have multiple campuses already, one of which is an online campus that sort of exists. But I guess the question is asking is about bricks and mortar and about whether they continue to have a space in this. And my answer is absolutely they do. The campus experience is still fundamentally part of a university experience. What it has done, and what this moment has really done, from my perspective, is transform the way in which we understand our role as educators in the process. The idea that it was ever a great idea for one person to stand in a lecture hall and transmit to 200 or 300 people and expect them to receive and accept all of that information in one go was clearly ridiculous. And I think actually the opportunity we now have to transform things like lectures is really fantastic. And I've already said to my university that we really must not have any concept of going back to the lecture as transmission. I'm not saying lectures aren't great things when used properly as performance and giving a show about a particular topic. So it's been absolutely amazing working with the EdTech world, and we've been working with a large number of EdTech startups over the last few years. And what we've learned from them is not only about education, but also how we operate as teams of people, thinking and working together and meeting together, and how we operate the university behind the scenes as well as in front of the scenes. So this moment has been transformational. The task now is about not letting some of that transformation slip backwards and not trying to drift back into the ways we were, because our students demand of us to be to catch up to them and to use technology to really support personalization of learning and to make our time useful in the learning process rather than it simply being an act of teaching. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. And now we'll move on to Alison Littlejohn, who is the director of the UCL Knowledge Lab, which is a centre exploring the future of education with technology at the UCL Institute of Education.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to know that there are a lot of people who are considering going to university who are watching this right now, and also their families. And I know that people probably have some concerns about what will university be in the next academic year. So there's certainly been a disruptive moment in all parts of society over the past 3 months, where we're all now working from home, and in fact we're doing a study at UCL to see what the impact of that is on university staff, and notwithstanding the impact on students. But I think we have to think about these disruptions in both short term and long term, and I want to distinguish between online and distance. So online learning does not always mean at a distance. It can be what we call blended learning, and from that we mean sometimes you learn using technologies like we're doing right now. We're having a dialogue via technology, but other times you might actually meet face to face. And if we think about distance learning, then organisations like the Open University offer a great model of what that looks like. But the reason why students choose campus-based universities is very different, and often the reasons are around just being away from home, being on campus and learning lots of other things apart from the discipline that they're learning. It's also about meeting people from all over the world. It's a fantastic opportunity to really get to know all different people, cultures, people from everywhere with all kinds of perspectives. And we don't want to lose that. So in the short term, we've seen what was termed a pivot online. So almost over a weekend, most campus-based universities started teaching online. And that meant that rather than having the lecture, which tends to be a social gathering of students and a lecturer who's modelling how to think like a teacher, an accountant, a virologist, a philosopher, we went to online content. So that could be either online lectures or other forms of content which are involve activities for students. And that's been very different. In the next academic year, most universities have said that they'll use a combination of this kind of online learning with face-to-face campus experience. It's going to be quite different from what was before, because we're not going to see these large lecture rooms with hundreds of students. But actually what might be an offer, potentially it could be better. So the idea is to have either some videos or readings or some kind of content that students will work on, so that when they do get together in much smaller groups, they'll be able to discuss or have feedback from the lecturer or from other students. And that will really support learning. But in the longer term, we're not sure what, how whether lectures will make a comeback. They probably will. However, we're hoping that technologies will be more embedded in the everyday learning experience. And some of the real disruptions that we see in universities might not be about teaching and learning. The universities have developed scenarios as part of their business contingency planning. Most universities are planning for the worst case scenario, where we have a really big drop in the number of students who come to university. But of course, we're hoping for the best, because the idea of being part of a university and part of something bigger is amazing and wonderful. But there's a degree of uncertainty that we're working within, and that uncertainty is really off the scale, making it really difficult for us to predict. But the disruptions are likely to be around the kinds of business models that universities use, where universities get their income, and how they use that to fund all the different activities that they do. It's not just teaching, it's also research and contributing to society. And we've seen that as part of the COVID-19, when the government has looked to universities to develop new vaccines or ways of tracking and basically help us get over the pandemic. And some of the biggest disruptions could be about rethinking how we use the campus estate. We're certainly going to continue to have campuses, but how we use them could be quite different. Also, how staff at universities are promoted. Are we going to focus so much on research, or over the next few years, are we going to also consider much more teaching and the importance of that to university? And also how we embrace diversity to enable people to work. A lot of people have been working at home and really enjoying that, but we need to really think about diversity in all its dimensions and embrace that within the university.
Thank you. Now let's move on to Lee Belsky, who's the Chief Enterprise Officer at Coursera, which is a private online learning provider that is one of the world's largest education companies, which has been assisting universities around the world with the shift to online learning.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you again for having me as well. So I agree very much with what Alison just shared, and to put some of what she said in context, when the pandemic started spreading over the world in March, UNESCO reported that we had over 1.6 billion students who were suddenly out of school. And in the wake of that change, what we saw is universities investing in a tremendous amount of crisis response education and experimenting in ways that they hadn't before. Just to give a historical context, traditionally education is the sector where there's the least amount of digital investment. The education sector invests less than 3% of their overall revenues in digital infrastructure, and that is radically different from some of the leading industries. And our prediction, and my prediction at Coursera, is that we are never going to go back to the old way of learning. And what I mean is a couple things. One, I suspect that moving forward, education, particularly higher education, is going to be much more personalized. So there are going to be students around the world who can't return to their university because of immigration reasons. There's going to be students who can't return because of safety or because of the pandemic, and they're going to have an option whether to continue learning online or to return to the lecture hall. There can be students who don't want to return because they've had the experience of being able to learn from home and they've realized that it's much more effective for them. And because of that, I think every university is going to now need to offer students an opportunity to learn in different ways and not necessarily come to campus the way they used to. I think the second big change that we're going to see is that there's going to be much more focus on whether a university is actually teaching its students job-relevant, career-relevant skills. Because what happens if you take away the opportunity for the social interaction, if you take away the opportunity to come to campus and to interact with professors, education actually becomes a much more transactional experience. I give you my time, I give you my efforts and money, and in return, I expect something very concrete from you, which is learning. We at Coursera, as Rachel said, run one of the largest global online education platforms, and we put out courses from the leading universities around the world. And in the wake of the pandemic, we've actually seen 5 times as much traffic as we saw before. And we also made our software available to universities around the world so that they could use courses from any of the top universities on their campus during this time. And so what it means is that students around the world, they didn't stop learning, but instead they got a taste of what it was like to learn data science from Johns Hopkins, one of the best universities in the world. They got an experience of what it's like to learn coding and Python from Michigan. And so now they're going to now expect to be able to learn those very top skills and key courses when they go back to school as well. And I think that's going to change the nature of the relationship between the university and the student. And I think the last thing we've seen is that there's going to be a lot more collaboration among educators and among universities. So to give you an example, very early on in the pandemic, Duke University reached out to us because their campus in China, Duke Kunshan University, was shut down. And what they said is we don't have a way to suddenly have all of our teachers automatically teach online in Zoom, but can we use the courses from your catalog from other universities and match them to what our teachers would have been teaching. And so what you saw, whereas historically there's a resistance for universities to use courses from others, suddenly there was no choice. And I think the genie's now out of the bottle. It doesn't make sense for every university to teach its own Psychology 101 course. It doesn't make sense for every university to teach its own data science course or to teach its own coding course. It makes sense for us to identify who are the best teachers in the world, and every student at a university to have access to that best teaching. And then the role of the university becomes more about facilitating the learning, facilitating the overall experience. So I think we are going to see a very, very different experience in higher education. Students are going to have an option to have a personalized experience. They can learn online or offline. They're going to be able to be much more demanding to ensure that their university is allowing them to learn top skills and to learn them for the best professors. And I think we're going to see much more collaboration in education so that universities can lean on each other where one is strong and others are weak. And the whole sector is going to be advanced together. And I think it's going to be a moment of really, really welcome digital transformation that's going to improve both access to education as well as the quality of education for many, many students.
Thank you, Lee. And now moving on to Mark Andrews, who has the exotic title of Pedagogical Evangelist at Adobe, which is very kindly supporting this event today. And Mark previously worked on developing online and blended learning at Cambridge University's Judd Business School. He's kind of got a foot in both the tech and the higher education worlds.
Yeah, hi, and yeah, thanks for having me, Rachel. So I'm going to be quite brief, but I mean, really, as we all know, over the past few months, we've been as a sector put into this kind of experiment that no one planned for, that has really accelerated thoughts and ideas that were kind of already being developed. I think, as Ian mentioned, in pockets within institutions around the future of learning, the future of education. But what it has done is it's crystallised discussions within institutions about, how do we now draw on and lean on some of this technology to help deliver a really good student experience. And so what I found from my experience at the university was that it really acts as a catalyst to convene discussions that, 6 months ago would not have been possible about how do we bring some of the pedagogical methods and ideas and development approaches into the real mainstream and the core delivery of our teaching and learning. And within that, what I saw was a real sense of innovation and inventiveness amongst our faculty to work with us to really develop the best learning experiences possible. So as you've mentioned, I've recently joined Adobe from the University of Cambridge, so I'm aiming to bring to this discussion kind of perspectives from both my experiences working within an institution and then now also working for a company focused on creativity. What I think we're going to see is an increased role of collaboration, as Leah mentioned, between the different sectors, between institutions, and it's something that I think universities are now starting to do more of. We're going to see more focus on the student learning experience, and I think now rather than digital being kind of a little silo on the side, we need to look at how do we blend that kind of campus feel to blend across the physical and the digital. So with that, we're looking at user-centered learning design. We're looking at the integration of learning professionals and developers and learning designers, content developers to work with faculty to really design really good learning experiences that work both in and outside the classroom. We're looking at how we realise digital pedagogy for things like lifelong learning. We're looking at, as Alison mentioned, at new business models about how can we use this to widen the reach of education to often marginalised students or non-traditional students to help lifelong learning. And I think that's one of the key benefits we're going to see is I think we're going to see the real birth of true lifelong learning that looks at knowledge, skills and behaviours. So I'm really looking forward to exploring this further with you all over the next hour.
Perfect, thank you very much. Great, well, so I've got a few questions for some of our panellists and then we'll move on to some of the participants. Please keep sending those in. Looks like there's lots of interesting things coming up. So just to return to Ian, so your Coventry University Online is a model that you've been working on for a while and which predates the coronavirus pandemic. So you've obviously thought about what the ideal online experience is, as opposed to kind of creating one that's the product of circumstance. And I was wondering what you see, blended learning is a real buzzword at the moment for prospective students this year. What do you consider to be the right blend of online and offline experience? And do you think that that is what students are going to get in September across the sector?
There are lots of questions there, Rachel. I think the first thing I'm going to say is Coventry University Online we set up 3.5 years ago now, and rather back to Leah's point about the lack of digital investment by universities, we were very, very willing to build a new building at 100 million, but actually investing in the digital campus as an investment of a similar scale, I think is something that we ought to have been doing for a very long time, and we really haven't, and that's a great weakness. We made a considerable investment in creating Coventry University Online, and we now have 25 fully online degrees. One thing that the pandemic has really sort of taught me is that the modes of online are different. I see that experiment, that activity, as very much building online for people who are committed to online learning and who want a fully online experience. I think in some ways what we're talking about, quite a bit of what we're talking about at the moment here and now is online for on-campus learners and how that fits together. And just to take Leah's point a little further, I think there's a third broad form of online learning that needs to develop, which is very much the transactional stuff about accreditation of experiential learning, and on a mass scale for people who want to upskill and develop their skills, where we use technology to navigate the vast amount of resource that's out there and point students towards things rather than teaching them. And that's a very different form that is really in its infancy, but I really think there's a big place for that. I worry very much that if we're not careful, we risk creating tiers of online learning, and so the repute and the esteem that a degree studied in one mode or another will be of higher or greater value than others, and that I worry about very much. And we need to make sure that we don't create new disadvantage in those online modes. So the blend, and the answer to the final part of your question was about what are students going to get. Certainly from my perspective, we're going to be able to offer online classes and on-campus classes. We're making sure that the on-campus stuff are the things that are really important, the transformational bits that are best delivered in that mode. And lots of people have made that reference to making sure that those are the things that are really needed in that way. But we are looking at how you deliver those things, including laboratories and workshops, a really difficult question, how you deliver those in online mode so that students can start fully online, and during the semester, as they perhaps develop confidence, they can move to have some classes on campus, or they can continue fully online. And that's where I am in my head right now, trying to figure out how you offer both of those things, and how you are completely honest in making sure that people understand what they're going to get, and why for some people on campus, and why for some people online, and why for somewhere in between is a good mix.
Thanks. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I think also that the term blended learning, well, the term online learning is really loaded, isn't it? And it covers a whole myriad of kind of models, from, the professional development, the mandatory professional development you have to do on compliance training, all the way through to very rich learning experience. And so I'd like the term blended learning. Again, that's also a very contested phrase. It means different things to different people. The way that we spoke about it at the Judge was around it's a mix of synchronous and asynchronous. And of course, both of those types of learning can happen both totally physically or totally online. And so when we talk about the blend, we talk about the mix of the synchronous and asynchronous. And by thinking about it and taking away the environmental factors, what we found is that you could start to design modules and programs that were abstracted from the kind of the physical or digital location of where you were, and focus more on the activities that you were trying to elicit and you were trying to do. And I think that's quite a helpful way of thinking about it. And then we're not then thinking about, well, what is this online? We start to think a little bit about what that crafting of the learning experience is. And we kind of refined that over kind of 4 years at the business school, where we developed 3 really successful blended, part-time blended learning programs, where 70% was online, some of it a mix of synchronous and asynchronous, 30% on campus. But we found that moving that totally online was actually quite easy, because you were moving the the synchronous bits, rather than being in lecture theatres and in small group teaching, we're able to do that through Zoom. So it wasn't actually that disruptive, and the learning experience and learning outcomes weren't altered too much. And so I think it's worth just thinking a little bit about how we use that term and what we go to mean by that.
Sure. Could you, for anyone who's not aware, could you clarify synchronous and asynchronous learning for us?
Okay, synchronous, this is what's happening now. We're all talking, we're all discussing. Asynchronous, we're kind of watching videos, usually good for getting kind of content, getting information. Synchronous, to me, is highly collaborative and is talking in dialogue. Yeah.
Great. I know it's a brave new world for a lot of people. So, and Leah, I wanted to ask you a little bit, since you've got such a kind of wide expertise in online learning across the world. I mean, so here in the UK, there's been a lot of discussion of students thinking of deferring because they're a bit anxious about online learning, or they feel that's not what they want from universities. There's also countries around the world where the governments don't take online credentials quite so seriously as ones from kind of bricks and mortar campuses. And I was wondering where you think the stigma around it comes from.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the stigma of online learning probably comes from just a general fear and hesitance about change and about the use of technology. When people started learning online, there was a sense that online learning was lower quality or it was a cheaper alternative. And I think now we're at a place where that's very different, and it's not always, it's just not true. And I'll give you a couple examples. I think the thing that sticks in my mind is Coursera actually was able to run a natural experiment. So we worked with the University of Illinois and we put together an online MBA with them. And that online MBA ran in parallel to an on-campus MBA. And we started out basically trying to recreate a university experience. So you would have, as Mark said, synchronous classes where everyone would have to wake up at a certain time and join an online class, and the students would be able to chat and discuss. And a few months into that program, we actually surveyed students and we said, do you prefer to actually be able to watch videos on your own time, or do you prefer to have to show up for classes? And they said, you know what, we actually don't like to have to show up at the same time. We'd rather learn on our own schedule. And so suddenly we did less synchronous classes. And a few years in, they actually surveyed students, would you rather learn online or would you rather learn on campus? And the students actually responded. They said, we'd rather learn online because it's customized to our lives. We're able to learn from anyway. And the University of Illinois actually this year decided to shut their on-campus MBA. And so I think it's an amazing story of how through collaboration, through innovation, both Coursera and Illinois were able to see what are the advantages of an online program. And we saw that students very much prefer online. And I think now we're in a place where it's not so much about stigma, it's more about opportunity and students figuring out which are the best online opportunities out there. To give you a sense of how quickly things are changing, in the past day, I've talked with a top university in Jamaica. I've spoken with a leading university of Nigeria. I got off the phone last night with a top university in Kazakhstan. And what all of these universities say is a combination of, we don't have the faculty to teach the skills of the future on our campus. There are just fields that are changing so fast, and I can't hire local faculty to teach them. And so what courses do you have that can allow our students to have access to these skills through online means? And then the second thing they say is our business model is changing so rapidly, and we need to lower the cost of delivering education. And so they realize that by collaborating and using online courses, they can significantly reduce the cost of delivering high quality education, and their students suddenly are getting access to some of the best courses in the world. So I do think we're fairly beyond the place where there's as much of a stigma in online education. Unfortunately, in many emerging markets where there's a least amount of digital penetration, there's still a lot of regulation, as you said, around online learning. India recently changed regulations so that students can spend 20% of their learning time online. And there's now proposals traveling through the government about allow students to spend 40% of their time. Other universities don't actually allow students to learn online. So I also hope that through this period of COVID and through this rapid period of experimentation, governments will also start revising their policies so that more students can learn online. But of course, the courses would have to be vetted by the universities and the faculty, and the accreditors will assess that the online learning that's provided to students is still top quality. But I think that stigma is rapidly going away.
That's really interesting. Alison, you'd like to come in?
I think we have to remember that we talk about the student experience and students as almost as if the students are homogenous and they all want the same thing. They don't. One of the things that we've seen over the past decades is that there's an increase in lifelong learning, and the reasons why people learn are varied and different. So it used to be that people would go to university, get their degree, and they'd be set up for their careers. But now, of course, far higher proportion of students go to university, and then when they go into their careers, they may have to change their career several times, and therefore they would want to go back to university to retrain or study a master's or a doctorate, for example. So it's a very, very different context. And if we think about all those different groups of students, they will want very different things. So if you're working, for example, you probably prefer online learning, or it gives you an option to be able to manage the time you spend at work with the time that you're studying. If you're studying for a master's, you probably, maybe you do want to meet people face to face, but you probably want to do some through technology. If you're an undergraduate, you're much more likely to want a campus experience, and that's because for a lot of undergraduates, what they actually learn is not just about the topic in the discipline. It's really about learning about the world, interacting with all these different people from everywhere, seeing what academics do. So it's a very, very different experience. So as we go forward, we're likely to need very varied different offerings for different groups of people. But I think that more and more these different offerings will include some kind of technology element.
Thanks. Ian?
Just to follow up a little on Alison's point there, I think even then to take the UK undergraduate population a little further, we know that the demographics of our undergraduate populations have been changing so rapidly over the last few years. We think about the role of commuting students in our populations, and commuting students covers all sorts of reasons for people commuting, some of which are for family and caring responsibilities. Others are because of financial pressures and family pressures. There's so many different types of student in our population. So if I take my student population on my Coventry principal campus, a third of my students are international students coming from 150 countries, for whom that international experience is a fundamental part of what they're looking for. Out of the 2/3 of the UK student population, the UK domicile population, probably approaching 40% of them are commuting students, but some are commuting from really close by, taking public transport, which is a big question right now. Others are commuting from London to Coventry, and all of those circumstances. The whole of our UK undergraduate population has also changed, and therefore I think that conversation about the blend, whatever that might mean, and the conversation we had previously, is really important, because what we're trying to do is to personalise to individual circumstances, and circumstances I don't believe we invest enough in trying to understand our student populations deeply enough and involving them in the development. We talk lots about co-creation, and that gets tied up in curriculum. Actually, the co-creation that we really should be doing is about their lifestyles and the way in which they live their lives, and the way in which we can then respond to them through using blending technology and campus and so on to really provide a great learning experience.
So, both Alison and Ian, you've kind of picked up on how online learning can benefit sort of disadvantaged students or students who wouldn't otherwise be going to university. But there's also, a concern that I've come across around kind of issues with access to technology, and also the idea that kind of more vulnerable remote students could become even more remote. And I was wondering, I don't know who'd like to pick up on this, but just how universities can avoid kind of those more vulnerable students sort of dropping off their courses or curriculum.
Shall I start?
Okay.
one thing to remember is, yes, access via technology is really important, and what universities can do is to have various different schemes so that more vulnerable or disadvantaged people have access to technology in all different ways. I mean, universities have been doing this for some years. I think that one of the access issues, which is often not really brought to the fore, is that it's not just about having access to a laptop or a tablet or whatever, it's being able to learn. So one of the things that universities really have to do is to encourage and support students who are not very self-regulated in their learning. So they need a bit more support to enable them to be able to learn. We have so much access now to online information and resources and so on, that ability to learn and direct your own learning is becoming increasingly important. But I think it's often overlooked because we tend to think about technologies, courses, resources, and so on. But we need to enable students to be able to learn.
Ian?
Can I just come in? I completely agree with the comments that Alison's just made. I think the universities we have to take responsibility, however, for some design principles here. And I think Mark and Leah and everyone said it. You know, the pedagogic design that underpins an online course, just simply lifting and shifting, it was simply that moment of disruption in many ways. We can't do that, and people will not tolerate it. It will turn people off and set back some of the online approaches if we continue to do that. So pedagogic design that allows people to, you know, I don't know about you, but when someone offers me a video of an hour of someone talking about the subject, I rarely get beyond minute one because it's just too painful. That's really not easy to do. What I need is engagement. So we have to think about the pedagogic design. I think we also, and yes, we need those schemes to support the technology kit type stuff out to people who don't have access to it. But there's also space and time and an environment of learning, of course. But from a university perspective, designing for mobile has to be where we are, not designing for a laptop or designing for a desktop was fine under the old virtual learning environments, perhaps of 10 years ago. But mobile is certainly where we need to go, and we have to invest quickly and hard in making mobile first the approach, because that's one of the technological answers. It's not a panacea, but it's one of the things that we need to do in order to give greater access to more people.
Right.
I think just to add a little bit. I'm sorry. Just to add a little bit on that, I think it's a great question. You know, how can we make online education accessible to both vulnerable populations? I think Alison and Ian talked a little bit about the technology challenge there, but I think the other side of this is, you know, there's many people who just never had access to education before, and what online education actually does is it opens the doors to education. You know, I look at these past 3 months and I look at where people are coming from who are joining Coursera. It's countries like Afghanistan, it's Egypt, it's Saudi Arabia, and these learners are people who wouldn't necessarily have been able to get into their traditional university. They might not have had the financial resources, they might not have been allowed to study, they might have lived in neighborhoods or in locations where they had to work and couldn't otherwise join the university. So what's mind-blowing to me is that online education is really opening the doors the universities. And now I'll go online and I'll go into classes that we have on Coursera, and you'll see these learners in Slack groups. You'll see them in forums together, learning together in ways that just wouldn't have otherwise happened before if everyone was required to show up on campus. And so I'm super excited about the potential for online education to both enable more access, but also allow people who just wouldn't have had the financial resources or needed to work to join and be part of an online learning experience. And I think we have a lot of thinking to do to make sure that as we transition to more digital experiences, how can each university also be much more intentional in making sure that they recruit students who now could actually join and start learning online, who might not have otherwise done so.
Thank you. And just quickly, before we move on to the questions, just wanted to ask you, Alison, one of the other sort of criticisms about the rapid shift to online learning that I've been hearing is around the pressure it's been putting on academics. And you mentioned the survey you were doing at UCL, and as an academic yourself, how well do you think universities have managed this, and what do you see as the kind of pressure points in that?
It's remarkable how well universities have done when you consider the scale of the challenge there was. A lot of colleagues, the staff in universities have made heroic efforts to move teaching online. But of course, with that, there comes a cost. So yeah, we're doing a study across UCL. It's called UCL Moving Online, where we've looked at how people are coping with working from home, which is very different, researching online, and teaching online. And so some of the issues associated with teaching online are, well, firstly, just moving to the online teaching. There has to be a lot of upfront investment in terms of creating the resources, putting them online. It's a very different rhythm and way of working from producing lectures and going into a lecture room and actually talking with students. So that has required huge effort from colleagues. And of course, we're also in a pandemic, so it's not as if we're just simply moving online. We're dealing with our students many of them having to go back to their families wherever they are around the world. Sometimes they don't have very good broadband where they are. We had Chinese students who had to go into quarantine for 4 weeks after they went back home, and it was very difficult to teach them. We actually learned quite a lot about how to be able to interact with them. And colleagues have been spending a lot of time giving pastoral care to students, and that has taken much more time than usual. Students have been anxious about the pandemic and what's going to happen, and the colleagues have been there supporting them. And not only are they supporting them, they're doing it from their homes. So many people are actually working from their bedrooms, so they can't actually physically get away from work. So there are a lot of issues there. What we're doing at UCL is going through each of these issues one by one and thinking about how can we address those. For example, if people have limited space at home, should the campus, when we open up the campus, should it be opened up primarily for people who don't have very much space? Would that help them? How do we reward people who've really stepped up? How do we make sure, one of the measures of progress for many academics is publications and research. A lot of people have stepped back from that in order to support either colleagues or students. So we really have to rethink the environment that we're in. And for the next few years, it will probably be quite a different place.
Thanks for that. I'm going to move on to the questions. Going to try and get through as many of them as possible. So I'm going to focus on making sure that all the different topics are covered. One interesting one that's leapt out is from Timothy Smale, and it picks up on kind of our earlier discussion around access. And he wants to know whether the panel feels that a shift to online delivery will advantage or disadvantage students with disabilities, and how can any disadvantages be mitigated? Mark, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And we just started the programme of work at the business school looking at accessibility. Obviously, there's new regulations coming in, which is a great catalyst for institutions to really on board with this. But I think one thing that we've tried to build in from the start of our design process, we use a design thinking process to learning design, is to build in the notion of universal design. And with that, to really try and build, because the evidence would show that if you design for all, you're actually designing better for everybody. And so it's a real hot topic at the moment. It's a real issue moving online. I know there's obviously a lot of companies that are looking at how we can automate some of these processes, but fundamentally we've got to do it at source in the way that we actually prepare our teaching materials, in the way that we design our activities. And so with that, we're in a process of really trying to go across the school. We were on universal design as for education. But yeah, it's definitely something to look out for.
Great. And kind of an interesting question here from Ingo Cornels. To what extent will the rush to online delivery create a new dot-com bubble bonanza for tech providers or businesses? Any thoughts on that one? Go ahead, Alison.
I think that we already have that bubble, to be honest. There are lots and lots of startup companies who are working with universities or working as standalone providers. So we're already there. One of the big concerns amongst some of my colleagues who are basically observing and commenting on the digitalization of education is a worry about data and how it's used. And we have to think about how public organizations like, I mean, not every university is a public organization, but many are, and private organizations. Both these different types of organizations have different drivers and different motivations. So there are big questions about how we work together to make sure that we move forward for the benefit of the students and of society.
That's a really good point. Oh, go ahead.
I wanted to also jump in there after Alison as well. It's an interesting question. Will the rush to online create a bubble? The education technology sector has traditionally been a sector that there's just not enough investment in. The largest tech companies in the world, and I would say Adobe is actually an exception because Adobe has invested heavily in education, haven't really spent much time investing in the education market, despite the fact that if you look at education spend as a percentage of GDP, it's one of the largest sectors, but it's considered slow and highly regulated. So I actually think we're in a very different moment now where the largest companies in the world are suddenly realizing this is a space where things are changing and there's room for innovation, and investors are saying, they're calling companies up and they're saying, how can we actually make these companies more successful? So I think it's less about a bubble, but in the same way that the universities were underinvested in technology, the technology sector as a whole was underinvested in education. And I think there's a big opportunity now for that level of investment to change, and it's sorely needed.
That's a really interesting point as well. But sort of picking back up on that kind of data gathering point, or from a slightly different angle, we've got a question from Elizabeth Avery, who's a learning designer at Coventry University, and she wants to know, with large cohorts of students, how are people planning on monitoring and tracking engagement and picking up with students who are struggling?
George, carry in.
Yeah, go for it.
Well,
Okay.
I think one of the areas that we that really has to be invested in and is being invested in is learner analytics. Learner analytics has been around for a little bit of time, but at the moment it's pretty basic, to be really honest. We've been using it for quite a few years to monitor engagement, and it's a slightly post fact engagement sort of, but I can demonstrate that we can nudge students back into engaging with their studies and to be successful. That's great. I think the next phases are the really exciting ones, where we understand the learning approaches and learning styles of students through the way in which they're engaging with content and the type of content, the amount of time they dwell on pieces of content, and all of those sorts of things. And we can also start to, with all of the safeguards that we absolutely must put in place, look at the well-being sort of aspects, so that we're not just looking at the learning, but we're also looking at the pastoral. And then, so with some clever design through the data scientists and the psychologists and so on, I think there's some really interesting space there. Universities have historically been enormously rich in data, but just completely hopeless in managing that data. And we throw it away largely, and we don't use it to help manage the process. I know in my conversations with some of the biggest tech companies in the world, and we won't name any of them, but some of them have big conferences with education in order, because they know the richness of data in those places could serve them in all sorts of interesting ways, both for education and I'm not going to suggest that there won't be some commercial sort of ambitions behind it for them too, but that is absolutely essential. Alongside the learning design, we must get the analytics right, because that way we can really start to personalize the learner journey.
Mm-hmm. Just to return to that well-being point, we've got a question from Dolores Collins, who is a parent, and she is wondering about kind of the impact on students' mental health from not mixing with people in the same way and the possibility for isolation. So she worries that if her son were to learn online in his bedroom, it would have a high price on his mental health. And she particularly would like to hear from Lee Balsky about kind of ways to mitigate that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for the question. I think it is a concern, and parents need to be very careful about which programs they select. So I was telling you a little bit about this program in Illinois, and there the students are from all over the world, and they have a huge amount of interactions. They have Zoom office hours where they jump in and they talk to professors. They're able to spin up virtual classrooms to have study groups. They're on Slack all day, they're on text all day, and they're very, very highly connected. And I think there's many programs that are like that, where students are connecting and interacting in as many ways as they might otherwise as they are on campus. And in some ways, for some students, it's actually easier than breaking into a social group or getting an invitation to a bar or whatever it might be. But there's other online programs where they're not going to have these other tools that bring people together in social ways, because they haven't invested in those type of technologies, or they haven't intentionally built a culture in their university where they encourage students to form study groups and they encourage students to come together. I think mental health is hugely important. I think learning alone is a miserable experience. But if done right, technology can really make people feel a strong sense of community, and there's programs out there that are doing a fascinating job of doing that.
Alison, you wanted to pick up on that?
I think this is a very important question. Students and their awareness of their own mental health issues has become a big topic for universities over the past years. We know that we can do a much better job of supporting people. I think the situation we're in right now, where in the next academic year, it's very likely that students will do a lot of learning online, even if they're on campus, and they'll then have limited opportunity to interact with others face to face. What we need to do is be very creative about that. Students are going on campus to interact with others, to meet them, to socialize with them, to understand. So we just need to find very creative ways to enable them to do that and to get that mix of the learning from online materials, interacting in small groups online, like Leah said, and also meeting face to face and really getting to know people at a human level.
Thanks for that. There's an interesting question from Shauna, who wants to know if learning moves online or blended, will that eventually affect the cost of university fees, and whether there will be a tiered system. Does anyone have any views on that?
So I don't really have a view on low fees. That's definitely outside anything I would know about. But when we do look at the cost of delivery, at least we found with blended and full-time, the costs for blended are not dissimilar to full-time, because the upfront costs for the development for the learning designers and things like that do cost quite a lot. But you can then use that for multiple years and tweak it. Whether it will affect the costs, I'm not sure it affects the cost base hugely from my kind of limited experience. But I don't know, maybe Ian might know more from his experiences.
Do you have any thoughts, Ian?
Absolutely. I think I would hesitate to say that from a UK undergraduate tuition fee perspective, it's going to bring that down. I think that's, you only have to look at the cost of education through the school cycle and how expensive it is to educate. That I think therefore you have to question the whole value rather than necessarily the individual price. That £9,250 undergraduate tuition fee, because what does it cost to deliver a really quality experience? It would be catastrophic to say we're going to reduce that price and then deliver something that's really second rate. So I agree with Mark. The cost is it is really expensive to develop great online learning, but we should be held account to value for great online learning. So I think there's going to be a debate around it, but it's around the value rather than necessarily the price.
It's definitely an interesting question for the coming years. There are several academics who have questions looking for advice on how to move practical classes online. One's in film production, one is in healthcare, and I don't know if there's any broad principles that anyone can share. Alison?
So at UCL, we have a form of learning called connected learning, where we're thinking about how we connect the learning that students do with the amazing research that the academics are carrying out. And there is a course which every academic can go on. It's only 6 hours. So the idea is that you learn as you transform your course. I mean, I think the main principle from that is don't try to replicate the face-to-face online, but think about what it is from the online experience where students can benefit from learning online and using technologies. That's the number one thing. So don't have 1 hour lectures. We're actually advising colleagues not to have these synchronous or in real-time lectures where they use technologies, because that's where they're likely to have most issues and problems with technology. Also, it's not very engaging for students to hear someone give a lecture online for 1 hour. So we're advocating design principles where they have shorter and more engaging content and activities around those. And it's those activities, it's what the students actually do with the concepts and ideas that's most important.
Great. Thanks so much for that. That's all the time for the questions that we have now. We've got about 3 minutes if anyone's got any last quick points or closing remarks that they'd like to make.
Sorry, I dropped out for a moment. Are you able to repeat?
No, it's just I'm just offering up the opportunity for any closing remarks if you'd like to make any before we call it a day.
Yeah, I'll make one if I could. So there's a quote that I found a couple of years ago that it's been my vanguard as we've been developing teaching and learning. And it's written in the business school context by Thomas and his authors in 2013, which said, "The rise and systemic shifts in opportunity, threat and challenges that new technologies offer mean that modern business schools," and I think we can broaden this out now, will need to become more student and educationally focused. And I think there is something to take from this. It's that we need to be really focusing on our students, bringing them in as co-creators, working on those employability skills that they need for their jobs and for their success in their careers. Now, Adobe's done some research on those skills. I think as a product offerings, our Creative Cloud products work well across all these environments and help to nurture those skills in critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. And so really, so just really a call just that we do need to really drive on being student focused and really bring them into the process.
And the other part, Alison?
So for anybody who's thinking about going to university next year, or families and supporters of people who are considering becoming a student, when you are a student, you become part of an academic community within a university, and there's nothing really compares with that. You become part of something which is much bigger than any individual. And one of the things we've seen during the pandemic is that governments worldwide have looked to universities to provide the knowledge through research to help us overcome the pandemic in all different ways. And so to become part of something which is so important and fundamental to society is incredible.
Those are some great closing remarks. Ian?
I'd just like to say, it is a big period of change and change that's been forced, but I think it's an incredibly exciting time. And so to all of those students who are thinking about study, yes, I understand there might be some nervousness. It's not going to be like it was before, but it's a really exciting time to go because the change and development and the opportunity is vast.
And Leah, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I would just say I've I've never been more excited about the potential for anyone anywhere to access high quality learning. And for those on the line who haven't had an experience with top quality online learning, I would encourage you to go to Coursera and just try it out. And you'll see what it's like to learn with students from all over the world and to learn with some of the best professors around the world. And it can be career relevant topics, or one of the most popular courses that people are taking right now is actually called the Science of Wellbeing, because they're learning about how to manage stress and how to manage themselves during this crazy time. So I encourage people to really try it, and you'll see where all the potential that we've all been talking about during this conversation.
Perfect. Thank you to all of our panelists for bringing such a wide range of views and perspectives to the table, for your fascinating comments. It's been really, really interesting. And also to our over 500 participants tuning in from all kinds of places. Really glad to have you all with us. And thank you very much for all your questions. And finally, thank you as well to Adobe for supporting the event. As I said, you can keep up with everything that's going on Guardian Universities at GDN Universities. We're also on the Universities tab on the main Guardian site as well, and look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much again.